Representative Benson, I'd like to follow up on your description of the IDs and how they're created, and specifically I wonder if you could provide us with any information about what kind of security features these laminated pieces of paper have.
Representative Benson.
Security features in terms of when they're made and when they're bound together in the laminating process?
Representative Winkler.
Well, Mr. Chair, Representative Benson, I guess I'm thinking of a comparison to a state ID that has holograms on it. There's a barcode in the back that can be used to check information. There's a magnetic card swipe. There's more to a state driver's license than just a picture and so on. And I guess what I'm wondering is what mechanism do you have to prevent somebody from just creating their own in their own dorm room or their own nursing home room?
Representative Benson.
Thank you. I think there's already cottage industry to duplicate, even though it might be more difficult, driver's license. So, you know, I've testified to it already that if there's a will and there's a criminal mind for it, there's probably a way, unfortunately. So, you know, in as much as is it absolutely foolproof, it is absolutely not absolutely foolproof, but it is a first step in making sure that people who present themselves to vote on Election Day are who they say they are.
Mr. Chair,
Representative Winkler.
Representative Benson, and I just want to make sure we're very clear. Your bill does not require any kind of photo identification for an absentee ballot. So if somebody were interested in impersonating another voter and they didn't want to go to the polls, they could just use the absentee process instead. Is that correct?
Representative Benson.
They would have to have somebody witness, and the absentee process does not change in this bill at all.
Mr. Ch
Representative Winkler.
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess Representative Benson, I don't really know what your bill accomplishes for the purposes of voter integrity or voting security. It's important to remember that when you go into the polling place and you sign on the line that says, "I am who I say I am," if you're misrepresenting yourself, if you're not that person, you've committed a felony. And we do have post-election audits to determine whether or not people are who they say they were on Election Day. And you can detect those irregularities, especially with felon voting. So you have, under your scenario, under your bill, you have someone who is willing to commit a felony in order to perpetrate voter fraud. But your bill would protect against a person who was willing to commit a felony and sign on the line to say that they are somebody that they were not. But that same person wouldn't be sufficiently motivated to fill out an absentee ballot. They wouldn't be sufficiently motivated to get a fake ID. They wouldn't be sufficiently motivated to get somebody to vouch for them for a birth certificate. I don't really know what kind of criminal mastermind you have in mind here, who would commit a felony but wouldn't take any of these other very easy side steps around this photo ID requirement. So I don't really understand, by watering down your bill this way, what you've really accomplished by doing it. And I'm afraid that creates a significant constitutional problem for you, because under the constitutional test, there are two things that have to be met. First, there has to be a problem, and second, what your solution to the problem actually has to accomplish the goal, or which is to solve the problem. And we've heard a lot of discussion about Indiana, and Representative Simon mentioned this, and Representative Downey might remember if he worked on their statewide voter registration system. They had huge problems in Indiana with their registration system. They had hundreds of thousands of dead people on their voting rolls. Still, they had a significant record of problems with the voting integrity in Indiana. You have no record of that in Minnesota. You have no basis other than fear and some fear-mongering by outside organizations about the integrity of Minnesota elections. You have no record to support it. And then the mechanism that you've created through this photo ID bill to correct this non-existent problem really doesn't do anything. The only thing it does is make it hard for some people to vote on Election Day, make them come back to the county auditor within 5 days and say, "I didn't have an ID." the only thing that I can see that this bill does is turn away people from the polls. And while everybody might be able to fill out a provisional ballot, not everybody gets that ballot counted, and that's the only thing that really matters.
Representative Benson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, there wasn't a question in there. There was a lot of statement. But first of all, it is constitutional. And second, provisional ballots, there are absentee ballots. There are already statutes requiring or outlining who is eligible to take one. And they're far easier to detect if there's fraud with an absentee ballot, simply because you can go to that person and because they have to not be able to make it to the poll. So it's not as hard to find out if someone is actually committing fraud as it might appear by your statement.
Representative Khan? She's gone. Representative Green?
Thank you. As some of you know, I'm sorry, Representative Benson, thank you for your work on this. As some of you know, I spent my teenage years growing up in the country of Pakistan. And at the time, it was a military dictatorship, and you can be sure that nobody there got to vote for the guy who was in charge. As romantic as it sounds for us to parallel what's going on here with what's going on in Egypt or other similar places with governments propped up by our government, these are apples and oranges. And I challenge all of us. I think when I knocked on doors, I was hearing about jobs. I was hearing about, health care. I was hearing about how can we protect, our most vulnerable neighbors when we're going to have to cut things, cut important state services. And I think this bill is really fear-mongering and a distraction from what we were probably all elected to do. And I'd really like to get back to work on some of those other bigger issues, rather than these 38 votes that we keep discussing. Thank you.
Okay, that takes care of the list of members that wish to raise questions. We will now start working our way down the list of folks who have asked to come forward and speak either for or against the bill. And we would ask the folks who are coming down to indicate at the outset if you're speaking in favor or against the bill. And we have some signs here, 2 minutes per person, and we have a 1 minute warning and then a stop sign. So, yeah. And we have first, and I understand they're coming down together, Joe Mansky, Tom Ferber, and Kent Sulam.